Well, welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon at the Gallery of Modern Art. My name is Chris Sains. I'm the Director of the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, and on behalf of the Gallery and the Institute of Modern Art, I'm tremendously pleased that we've been able to work together to jointly host today's very special international guest lecture by Simon Starling. To begin, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Jagera and Turrbal peoples, who have lived here along the edge of the Brisbane River for millennia. To elders past and present, I want to convey my deep and abiding respect for their ancient and enduring culture and acknowledge the contemporary contribution that they make to this place. Before I formally introduce our guest speaker, British artist Simon Starling, I just want to pause for a moment to acknowledge Robert Leonard, Director of the IMA. As you may know, I've recently returned to Australia from New Zealand, and Robert is soon to be taking the reverse track back to New Zealand to take up a new post as Senior Curator at the City Gallery in Wellington, a position which he takes up toward the end of this year. During his time here in Brisbane, Robert has led and arranged what I think most of us would agree has been a quite remarkable and remarkably diverse program of contemporary projects, programs and publications, a number of which I know firsthand from occasional trips to Brisbane, but obviously more recently being here. He's made a huge contribution, I think, to the art ecology of this city and will be greatly missed, although I know perhaps more than most that he's got some pretty important work to do in New Zealand, among which I hope that we see in a few years' time a fabulous project that Robert's been working on for a number of years, looking at the track of New Zealand and its contemporary art history from about 1965 to the present day. One of the defining features of the IMA project under Robert's leadership has been a commitment to international contemporary projects. In the last 6 months alone, most of you, like me, will have seen the Shane Cotton project, which was put together by the Christchurch Art Gallery and curator Justin Patton. You'll also have seen the Gregory Crewdson photography show, which was on earlier this year. More recently, the installation by Judy Miller, and coming shortly, a major new work by Simon Starling. Simon Starling's In Speculum is a joint project by Melbourne's Monash University Museum of Art, the IMA, and the City Gallery in Wellington. The project is currently on display at the Monash University Museum of Art, and it is the first survey of Simon's to be presented here in Australasia. In Speculum travels to the IMA in October and then on to Wellington early in 2014. In Speculum brings together key recent works along with a major new commission developed around the Great Melbourne Telescope, one of the largest of the 19th century's telescopes. The telescope is currently the focus of a major restoration project which is being undertaken in its home at the Museum of Victoria. Scientific exploration and astronomy was also the theme of Simon's film Blackdrop, which responded to the transit of Venus, a work that he made in June 2012, the transit of Venus, I should say, which occurred in June 2012. I know there were big events around Australasia, Tahiti and New Zealand in particular around that occasion. The extraordinary transits of Venus are especially important historical events for us, as it was while on a voyage to observe the 1769 transit that Captain James Cook charted Australia's east coast. Simon has himself captained some memorable voyages, most notably his 2005 Turner Prize-winning Shed Boat Shed, in which he dismantled a shed, fashioned it into a boat, he paddled down the Rhine, and then reconstructed it as a shed in the Basel Museum. Simon Starling was the first recipient of a Blinky Palermo grant in 1999, has been shortlisted for the Hugo Boss Prize for Contemporary Art in 2004, and is represented in many of the world's major modern and contemporary art museums. His work is in the permanent collections of Tate Modern, Moderna Museet in Stockholm, the Guggenheim Museum, Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Sydney, among many, many others. He lives and works in Copenhagen and Berlin, and is Professor of Art at the Stadel School in Frankfurt am Main. It is my great pleasure to invite Simon to speak more about his always wonderfully elaborate and always erudite projects. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end of Simon's talk, but importantly, I do urge all of you to see the exhibition when it comes to Brisbane in October. It's now my great pleasure to welcome and introduce to you Simon Starling.
Great. Hang on a second. Yeah, thanks for the warm introduction. And thanks for coming on a Sunday afternoon, a sunny Sunday afternoon, to sit in the dark with me. I'm gonna talk about, in a way, a particular sort of aspect of my practice, which has a sort of resonance in relation to the exhibition that will eventually make its way to Brisbane in a few months' time. And it's an exhibition that evolved out of a kind of a long-standing relationship with the curator Max Delaney, who many years ago in 1998 invited me to make an exhibition at Heidi, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And the exhibition sort of in a way foregrounds the idea of sort of work that thinks about its own making, that's kind of self-reflexive, that sort of interrogates its own sort of presence in the world, I suppose. And that's something that I suppose you can sort of track through many of the projects that I've made over the years. And it's it's an exhibition that sort of foregrounds sort of spaces where making happens. There's works which which I'll talk about, which take place or are played out, I should say, in a mask maker's studio in Osaka, in an 35mm editing suite in Berlin, and so on and so on. So there's this kind of, constant kind of interest in thinking about, making. This is my studio, an image of my studio in my studio. And a studio, in a way, a studio space has always been something a little bit sort of anachronistic for me. For a long time, I didn't really know what to do in studio spaces. I kind of made art in what could be described as a sort of post-studio condition, work that was made in very direct contact with the world and sort of tested in that world. So the studio has always been a sort of a bit of a conundrum in a way. But actually the new work that I made for the show sort of drags the studio into the practice in a much more overt way. This is just a rather beautiful gravure that I found, of course, which seems to sort of talk to the theme of the talk today. I'm going to start with some sort of quite early works. This is a work called Work Made Ready Kunsthalle Bern, which is a sort of an early example of a work that sort of thinks about making in a very proactive way, and sort of in some simple sense it's a sort of inversion of a ready-made, and of course through this choice of these two objects, an aluminium chair and an aluminium bicycle, it kind of nods to one of the first ready-mades, the Duchamp bicycle wheel. But actually what you're looking at is two objects that have had a kind of, like a genetic transfer somehow. And the metal from the bicycle was used to rebuild the chair and vice versa. And they're both sort of scarred by that process. Rough cast elements were sort of welded together but you sort of end up, it's a sort of elaborate detour in a way. You end up back where you started, but somehow the journey has marked the two objects. This is the other half of the work, the chair. there was more metal in the chair than there was in the bicycle, so some of the metal in the chair is the original, unchanged. Workshops. This is a studio that I had in Marseille in 1997. I was invited to do a residency in Marseille. I was living in Glasgow at the time, and one of the things that one of the sort of overarching concerns of the work is not just to think about the way things are made, but the sort of the geography of that. Living in Glasgow in the 90s, it was a kind of, it was sort of understood in those days as being a sort of provincial situation in terms of sort of the art world. And it's kind of changed over the years, but in those days, most artists who trained in Glasgow would leave and go and move to London or New York or one of the kind of conventional centers. But then this sort of generation in the 90s decided to stay in the city and try and make something of the situation, and were very sort of proactive about thinking about their own geography, the way they kind of created a map for themselves within the art world. And so that became a kind of concern for myself and for the work, and so often the works were built around a kind of the fact of, you know, working in one place and then going to produce a work in another place and so on, and connecting these places very kind of physically through the work. And this is a work, it's called Blue Boat Black, and it's a work that involved, I found I was given a rather beautiful old display case, a mahogany display case, which was in the National Museum of Scotland, an unwanted display case, and I took it apart and I put it on the roof of my car and drove down to Marseille for the residency, and then I used the wood from the display case to build this boat, a small fishing boat, which looked like that in the end. Quite a beauty, actually. But it had some strange markings from its former life as a vitrine, some keyholes and annotations. And then I went fishing. This is a much younger me. And eventually kind of managed to catch some fish, which were kind of frozen during it's hard to catch fish around Marseille these days. There's not many left. But eventually, with the help of another artist who was a bit of an expert, I managed to put together a decent meal. And then the boat, the small bark that I'd made was turned into charcoal with the help of a charcoal maker, and some of the charcoal was used to cook the fish that had been caught in it, and then the work was displayed as a sort of ranged out on this large table, the remains of the boat and some of the equipment from fishing, and the texts are of course the names of the fish that were caught, and again made with the charcoal from the boat. So a kind of little sort of microeconomic situation, sort of a rather absurd, unsustainable way of providing some food for some friends. As I say, my first kind of contact with Australia was in 1998 when Max Delaney came to Glasgow and put together a project called Strolling with a number of other organisations, Gertrude Street and some other spaces in Melbourne, and invited a group of Glasgow-based artists to come and make work in relation to some local Melbourne artists. And it was a very important moment for me. And it, of course, kind of coincided with my interests in trying to sort of think about the geography of making and to go halfway around the world to do something seemed quite exciting at that moment. And I sort of, at that time, I was often, the works came from these kind of, I had certain sort of orientation systems which I sort of used in locating myself in the world. And one of these things was often tracking down international modernist buildings as a sort of, I don't know, they exist all over the world, as the name suggests. And so I was very struck by this beautiful David McGlashan and Neil Everest house that the Reeds had built as their home, which is sort of now part of the museum there at Heidi. And I was also very taken with this tree, which is this kind of rather mythical tree, which has a scar in its bark, which is said to be the remnants of a canoe building project, Aboriginal canoe building project. A small canoe probably that would have been used on the little river that runs down the bottom of the garden. And that sort of put into play that the juxtaposition of this ancient canoe building tree and the modernist house put into play this kind of project which became known as Le Jardin Suspendu, the sort of hanging garden, so to say. And I went to Ecuador. I'd read Thor Heyerdahl's book about the Kontiki, and I knew that balsa trees came from Ecuador. And I decided to go and find some balsa wood to build a small radio-controlled aeroplane to fly above the house at Heidi for the opening of the exhibition. But rather than go to my model shop down the street in Glasgow, I went to the source. And I've always had a lot of luck as an artist, and I sent a fax to the British consul in Guayaquil in Ecuador. He was the first man who kind of came to mind. Maybe he can point me in the right direction. And I said I was an artist coming to Ecuador to try and find a balsa tree for a project in Australia, blah, blah, blah. And I got this fax back sort of 40 minutes later or something. And he'd scrawled on the bottom of the fax, "Dear Simon, I have a banana plantation. One of my balsa trees was struck by lightning. It's yours. I'll pick you up at the airport." And he did. And so that was, one of those amazing kind of, lucky breaks, I guess. So I went to this farm, this banana plantation in Baba in Ecuador, and cut a section of this fallen balsa tree and began the process of sort of transporting it back to Glasgow and on to Australia. And then I spent many happy weeks building this 1:6 scale model of a Farman mosquito, which was chosen because it's a plane that features in this sort of seminal book by Le Corbusier called Towards a New Architecture, which sort of muses on the relationship between boats and planes and buildings. And then the plane was flown rather precariously above the power lines of the garden at Heidi, and we eventually got it down. This is actually an image of the work as it now exists, not as it was exhibited in Heidi, but it has this kind of recreation of the window, the view through the window of the space looking out into the arboretum of trees that the Reeds were responsible for planting in the garden. And that's one of the works that will come to Brisbane. This is the shed, which again, lucky breaks. I was invited in 2005 by the Museum for Gegenwartskunst in Basel to make an exhibition. And I always had this sort of half-baked idea which I carried around with me that I would like to make a kind of bit of mobile architecture using some kind of structure that would then maybe be made into a boat. And it was a very unclear notion, but when I arrived in Basel to have my first kind of meetings with the museum, and I borrowed the curator's bicycle and made a trip out into the countryside just outside Basel. You pass through all these chemical plants and pharmaceutical companies. And then I kind of came out into this clearing along a path by the river. And there was this shed, this wooden shed with a paddle nailed on the side. And it kind of, in the space of about 5 seconds, this project took shape. The paddle belonged to a traditional river boat called a Weidling, which is a little bit like a gondola in a way. You stand at the back of the boat and paddle with this long oar. And so we called we found the people who owned the shed. And again, another stroke of luck, they sort of said, oh yeah, the shed, yeah, we've been trying to get rid of that for ages, please, it's yours. And they also provided us with this fantastic working space. And I co-opted 2 young Swiss artists, one of whom was a very accomplished carpenter. And we spent some happy weeks on the banks of the river building a Weidling from the wood. We dismantled the shed and then sort of numbered every part, and then chose the best of the timber and started to build this 10-meter long boat, which was then used to transport the remains of the shed down to the museum, about 12 kilometers downriver. And then, of course, the shed was reconstructed with all its new scars from its life as a boat. Strange holes and cuts and markings. But essentially a sort of rather inefficient bit of mobile architecture. This is a sort of Tom and Jerry inspired project. Which was made at Cove Park, which is on the west coast of Scotland, on Loch Long, which is one of the fingers of the Clyde estuary. It's a very, very beautiful place, but it's also the home of the nuclear submarine base at Fastlane, and there's a mountain there which is hollow and contains the nuclear warheads for the Trident submarines. So it has this sort of very strange sense, and it's a very, very deep lock. It's 80 meters deep in the middle, which is why they can bring the huge submarines up. And there's this kind of tradition of protest. There's been a peace camp as long as the Trident submarines have been there. There's been a peace camp as well, and they are involved in these incredible kind of escapades to try and keep the issue of nuclear arms in the press in a way. And they were a little bit of an inspiration for this project, which has a very long title. It's a sort of collage of Greek word. It's called autoxylopyrocycloboros, which sort of basically describes a kind of something that a wood-burning kind of self-consuming phenomena, which was the steamboat, which we slowly fed to its own boiler, until, of course, it ended at the bottom of the lake, of the loch. And that work is kind of shown as a slide projection on, there's 38 images which document this sort of entropic voyage around the loch, around the submarine-infested waters. One of the other projects that is coming from the show in Melbourne is a work called Willem Noack OHG, and it's a work that was made with and about a company of metal fabricators in Berlin, where I lived for 5 years. And I'd always wanted to try and find a way to make a work about Berlin somehow. I was working on a project for Barcelona, which involved making some metal work for a replica of a Lilly Reich. The German designer Lilly Reich, designed a lot of the displays for the 1929 exposition in Barcelona. And I tracked down some plans for one of her glass screens, and took them to these metal fabricators in Berlin called Noack. Somebody had recommended them. He said, oh, they'll know how to do that work. And I opened them up on the desk, and old Mr. Noack, he started to laugh. And I said, why are you laughing? And he said, well, actually, my father made the originals of these for Lily Reich in 1929. And I had no idea, and it was like a crazy sort of, coincidence. And so this kind of put this sort of seed of an idea in my head to make a work about them. And it's a company that's been going for 120 years in Berlin. They have a very particular kind of relationship to the infrastructure of Berlin. They built bits of, I don't know, Tegel Airport and many public sculptures they've been involved in, and so on and so on and so on. So they're sort of, in a way, the history of the company tracks the history of Berlin. They even made some lamps for Albert Speer at one time. So there's, it's a kind of amazing history. And slowly I managed to sort of get some. They began to sort of cooperate and finally opened up this incredible archive full of plans and photographs and from this kind of 120-year period, and that became the kind of the backbone of the work. And the work sort of evolved slowly from just being there in the workshop. It's this incredibly chaotic situation. It's like they never really... There's still objects hanging on the wall that were hanging there, in the 1940s. And it's incredibly layered, and it's all the history is somehow there in a very sort of, touchy-feely kind of haptic way in the space. And so I took a little video camera and started to think about how it might be possible to sort of document the space. And this little plastic video camera just didn't seem to be the right thing. So I then thought, okay, now we need a big a heavy metal 35mm camera. And suddenly this kind of, in a way, the aesthetic of the work was kind of generated. And what we did was we made it's basically a very short 4-minute film which documents the workshops and a lot of the images that I was talking about, the plans, the archive images, but does that without only using the available kind of mechanisms for moving the camera in the space. So, we used the winch to pull the camera up to make a panning shot of the wall, or there was this nice sort of pan made with the drill in the workshop, this big drill which made this camera spin, and so on and so on. So it sort of grew a sort of an aesthetic, a momentum from that sort of decision not to rent all sorts of fancy track and dollies and things like that. And then I sort of tried to find a solution for exhibiting the film, for showing the film that Noack themselves could be involved in. And I came up with this idea for a sort of spiraling loop machine that would run this 4 minutes of film. And in a way, the making of the loop machine becomes one of the subjects of the work itself. And it ended up looking like this. It's a sort of 4-meter high stainless steel pole with 84 arms, with little little spools on the end, which the film kind of runs up and around and then down back through the projector and so on and so on. It's actually a very good looper. It's very smooth and works very, very well. And of course, is then the images that you see projected on the wall. It becomes a very kind of self-contained, very hermetic sort of structure in a way. It sort of took me by surprise when I made it. It was actually a very hard work to sort of move on from, because I'd always been sort of struggling with this idea of how to build, process, or tell the stories of the making of something into the work itself. And suddenly I'd sort of found this way of doing that in a very sort of resolved way. And that was quite exciting. And of course, the Noacks turned up for the opening of the exhibition in Berlin. They were very, very proud. 3 generations of the Noack family were there. This is the looper. And it's also a film. I mean, it's a film about. It's also a film about the relationship between moving image and still image. I think very much. There's, of course, you see the frames, the individual frames of the film running through the loop machine, illuminated by the flickering image on the wall behind. And so yeah, there's a lot of still images in the film. So it's a kind of interplay between those two things, which has actually marked a lot of the filmmaking that I've done. I was always a very big fan of Chris Marker's La Jetée, which is only made from, apart from one tiny moving image moment, made from still images. I'm just going to show you the film. Actually, it's only 4 minutes long, so I just have to find it, and then. Where did it go? Oops. Oh, here it is. Video. Oh, what's going on? Uh-oh. Shit. Now I'm in trouble. Here we go. Full screen. And then it's a little jumpy. It's always been a little jumpy, this film, on my computer. I do not know why. I think I don't have a fast enough, whatever, processor or something, but bear with it. Oh, yeah, really jumpy. It's not, in fact, it's not working at all. Shoot. Okay. I'm sorry. I think we'll have to skip. No, it's not going to work. How annoying. I think it's, yeah, I've got too much open on my desktop, maybe. Yeah. Damn it. That's a shame. What can I do? Hang on a second. What is? Should be alright. It's weird. We'll try one more time. Huh? So that's Willem Noack. I'll just return to my PowerPoint. Yeah, this is a work that was made again, sort of arose out of a particular invitation to make an exhibition. This time in Montpellier in France, and I worked with at the FRAC in Montpellier with a curator called Ami Barak, who was originally from Romania. His family were from Romania, and I discovered he used a Romanian printer to print the catalogues for the FRAC in Montpellier, in part because it was cheap, but also because he had an old friend who was running a print house there and publishing business and ran the only Romanian art magazine. And this kind of very particular geographical sort of production situation sort of led to the making of a project which involved kind of making a catalogue, making an exhibition about the making of a catalogue in a way, and about the geography of that process. So I went to Cluj in Transylvania, which is where the printing works were. And on the way to Cluj, I made some photographs. And when I got to Cluj, those photographs were processed, scanned, and then printed. And then I started the process of documenting the printing of those images in the printing workshop. So it became, again, it's like a kind of, I don't know, a Russian doll structure of a project in a way. So it was also a little bit related to when I arrived in Cluj, there was this kind of upsurge of nationalism in Transylvania, and the local mayor was insisting on decorating the streets of Cluj with the Romanian colors, with light bulbs and flags, and somehow this had a nice relationship to the sort of CMYK printing technology that we were using to produce the book. And when we showed when we made the exhibition in Montpellier, we sort of made this rather festive installation in the street outside the gallery, using CMYK and RGB color systems to decorate and to mark the presence of the exhibition outside. Very much in the same kind of vein, thinking about the sort of the geography of making and sort of tracking things to their source somehow, like the balsa wood maybe. This is a work called 1 Ton, and it's a work that kind of evolved out of my interest, my early interest in sort of platinum printing. When I studied photography in the 80s, I started to try and make my own platinum prints, which is a very old process, photographic process, which is sort of long defunct in a way. Various sort of enthusiasts have tried to sort of reinvent the process. And I decided to go and find go to the source, I should say, of the platinum, of the metal that was at the heart of this photographic process. And so I managed eventually to persuade Anglo Platinum, this company who were mining platinum in South Africa, to allow me into the platinum mine. And I made a series of photographs there, very simple kind of images that just document this huge kind of open cast mine. You can just see the huge drilling devices and stuff in the bottom there of the image. And the prints that you just saw, these prints are actually a kind of they're a sculpture as much as they are a series of images in some sense. The number of prints and the size of the prints was determined by the amount of platinum that could be extracted from a single ton of ore from the mine. And so, yeah, it has this kind of yeah, it's a very, very simple kind of proposition in a way. And they're all the same image, just repeated as many times as could be with a certain quantity of metal. This is a work again that was something that it emerged out of a particular invitation to make a show at a gallery in Massachusetts called MassMocha, which is housed in an old industrial complex, originally a textile mill, printing mill. And at the time when I was invited to make the exhibition, it was this moment where everybody in America seemed to be talking about China and how China was stealing their industry, and it's actually very close to, MassMocha is very close to a university town, and all the people in the university were talking about, should we open a branch in China somewhere, or how do we get more Chinese students, and blah, blah, blah. So there was a kind of complete obsession in America at that time with China, and I'd heard this kind of story in a sort of one of these stories you hear, in a pub or something, about how some Chinese laborers had once come to North Adams, where MassMocha is, to work, and it was mistold to me. Is that somebody said that they'd come to make a tunnel for the train line. But actually, when I started to investigate the story more, I discovered that actually it was a group of migrant workers that were brought to North Adams to make shoes in the 19th century, and they were the first sort of migrant workers to come to that part of North America. There were about 70 of them, and they came to break a strike. The factory workers had gone on strike, and the Sampson, the owner of the factory, instead of sort of resolving the strike, he brought in some labor, and they actually ended up living in the factory. It must have been a very strange experience. And I found a stereo pair, these kind of stereo images, which were very common at that time, and took some silver particles extracted some silver particles from the photographic image, and worked with an amazing guy in Albany who used a 1,000,000 volt electron microscope to make images of these silver particles from the photograph. And then I contacted a foundry in Nanjing in China, and sent them some sort of rapid prototype models of the silver particles, which look like this. They're very strange. They look like kind of modernist sculptures in a funny kind of way, but sort of ones which, were clearly not made by a human hand. And they worked these small models up into large-scale forged stainless steel sculptures, which were then shown in the exhibition space in MassMocha, kind of reflecting the industrial architecture around them. It's a kind of process is extremely labor intensive, and the strange thing about it is that the harder you work, the less your work is visible. A really good forged piece of stainless steel is almost kind of superhuman or something, magical. So there they sat in the context of the sort of post-industrial. MassMocha was in a way an attempt to reinvent an economy in a very tough situation. This is another work which sort of foregrounds the making of the work in a very direct way. It's a collaboration that I made with Superflex in a museum in Jutland in Denmark, which it's called Blackout, and it's a project that involved creating two sort of situations to make things. One was a lamp workshop where a series of blackout lamps were made. Blackout lamps were designed by Paul Henningsen for Tivoli, the amusement park in Copenhagen during the Second World War, when there was a kind of blackout imposed on the city at nighttime, and they wanted to keep the amusement park open, so they got Henningsen to design these strange black lamps which only let light out sideways and wouldn't leak up into the sky. So they're a kind of anti-lamp in a way, a strange thing. And so we blacked out the museum and then slowly began to produce lamps. And while that was going on, we also produced a publication about the making of the exhibition in the exhibition space. So this is a huge Heidelberg printing press which was installed for the duration of the show, and every day a new page of the book was printed, documenting the process. And as the lamps were produced day by day, they were then hung on this kind of wire grid in the space and slowly began to illuminate the exhibition space. One of the other things that I've kind of been involved in is working very closely with sort of institutions in almost a sort of curatorial way, I suppose. I mean, I never really talk about it as being something different to the art practice, because it isn't. I mean, I've always worked with other people's artworks and with collections and archives, and so it's a very natural sort of extension of what I do as an artist. There's a kind of real culture, particularly in Europe at the moment, of institutions bringing artists in to sort of curate things or to sort of reinvigorate collections or rehang, or, you know, it's a real trope in museum culture at the moment. I think it's probably kind of, to do with finances too, but and when I was asked by the Folkwang Museum to make the last exhibition in a space that was about to be demolished to make way for a new museum building. The Folkwang Museum is supposedly the oldest modern art museum in the world, and they were collecting from 1904 onwards, connecting sort of really cutting edge kind of avant-garde work, also in relation to sort of ethnographic objects and other things. And I discovered that Albert Renger Patch, the now famous German photographer, was working there as a museum photographer for some years before the Second World War. They gave him a studio and a darkroom in return for documenting their collection and their art objects, and he made some very beautiful photographs of these rather idiosyncratic kind of installations of cutting-edge contemporary art in relation to sort of European antiquities and etc., etc. And some of them are just beautiful photographs of objects from the collection. And I discovered this one space in one of the old villas that housed the museum before the Second World War, that he'd photographed a number of times with the same installation in. And it was a building that was destroyed during the Second World War, like much of Essen. And this kind of imminent demolition of the museum building seemed to be a kind of interesting moment to dive back into this history. And these are more of the same images of the same space. And what we actually did was, sort of just using the information in these photographs, we made a reconstruction of the the space that Wenger Patch had photographed in the 1930s. In order for me to then remake his photographs kind of 75 years later. Again, a bit like the bicycle and the chair, a kind of strange sort of long detour to end up back where you started somehow. So this was, the space was built with the mobile wall systems that was also about to be destroyed with the building, which was reconfigured, and then the works from the collection were dug out, and we reinstalled everything. Some of the works had actually since disappeared. Some of the paintings were confiscated by the Nazis during the war and ended up in museums in Switzerland and North America, and those things we couldn't get back, but we made some very convincing replicas of them. And yeah, the color, of course, is speculative. We didn't know that the wall there was blue, but it seemed to make sense in relation to the rug on the wall, and so, yeah. And this was a part of the exhibition. You could wander around in this reconstruction of the museum. But in a way, the end result is a series of 4 black and white photographs, which are very, very close to Wenger Patch's original black and white photographs. It's kind of time travel, in a way. And yeah, this sort of notion of time travel kind of reappeared some years later in an exhibition that I made, that I curated for Camden Art Centre in North London, which is it's a wonderful place. They have an incredible history, and actually I have a very personal connection to Camden Art Centre because my great-great-uncle on my mother's side was the architect of the library, which is now Camden Art Centre. And I made an exhibition there in 2000, which involved building a small brick stove to cook some eggs. And we used some of the bricks from the walls of the museum. And at that time, some architects were coming to make drawings of the building because they were about to make some refurbishments to the building. And they drew my brick stove into the plans of the building as if it had always been there somehow. And it was this beautiful sort of connection with my relative, you know, through time in a way. And that sort of, I think it was one of the inspirations for the director, Jenny Lomax, inviting me to make this exhibition. And what I decided to do was to reinstate works in exactly the same place that they'd been shown previously. And they're works from a sort of 45-year period of exhibitions. And I sort of trawled back through the archives and found works that somehow sort of worry at the idea of time in different ways, push and pull at time, and then sort of created this sort of cacophony of an exhibition in which, of course, there were these strange kind of juxtapositions, and some things got laid on top of each other almost, or, you know, it was a kind of awkward installation in a way, just because everything had its place, and that was predetermined by history, by the past. So there were works this is a work by Francis Uprichard, a Keith Coventry cast bronze sapling from a modernist housing project in London, a Marcel Breuer installation from a show about the Isokon building. So constantly referring to the sort of historical photographs of the original installations, and then just sort of reiterating those things as closely as was possible. You know, there were rooms where, you know, 3 completely, in a way, disconnected things came together in interesting ways. This is a beautiful film by Matthew Buckingham about the first frames of moving image, made by a guy called Laprince, a French pioneer of cinema, who disappeared on a train mysteriously. And then a very nice work by Douglas Hubler, the American conceptual artist. It's a photograph made on the stroke of midnight between 1974 and 1975, and he sort of writes about how half of the exposure, an eighth of a second of this quarter of a second exposure was made in 1 year, and an eighth of a second in the other year. It's actually just a picture of his girlfriend at the time, I think. And then there were some small paintings by Paul Teck. One says timely and the other says timeless, etc., etc. I'm just showing you a few images. And the most expensive work in the show was this Francis Bacon painting, which was kind of hidden behind another work by Jeremy Miller. There was a rather beautiful chair, which an arts and crafts chair, which refers to Egyptian tomb furniture, sort of juxtaposed with a sort of thrusting modernist chair from Goldfinger, the architect, etc., etc. And that in turn sort of led to a kind of commission to make a work for the Duveen galleries at Tate Britain. And again, it was done in a very similar way, sort of putting things back in the space that had been there in the past, and creating this kind of collapse of historical time in the space, but this time in the form of a film, an 8-minute-long loop. It's this kind of roller coaster ride through the exhibition space made with this robot, the Milo motion control camera, which is a kind of time machine in a funny sort of way, a compositing device for collapsing time and space in cinematic sequences. Some of the works that were included had since been destroyed. A Fiona Banner Jaguar aeroplane had to be recreated in CGI and put back into the space that way. Other works. This is a sculpture by Michael Sandel, the British sculptor, made at the time of the Vietnam War, and which also looks like it's CGI, but it's actually not. And then Martin Creed's Runner, which was another commission for the space some years ago. Yeah, and that's actually still running. I think it runs till October or something. I'm aware I have to. I'm just going to sort of talk about the sort of two of the film works that are in the exhibition that's coming from MUMA, and one is a work that evolved out of my interest in the sculptor Henry Moore, who, in a way, I've used I was talking about earlier about the international modernist architecture, and I've used Henry Moore as a way of kind of navigating the world somehow over the years. And this is actually a production still from a work that was made in Toronto with a replica of a Henry Moore sculpture, which was called Warrior with Shield, which was thrown into the Great Lakes and used to grow zebra mussels, which are an introduced species which came to the Great Lakes after the end of the Cold War in the bilge water of trading ships, and were dumped in the lakes and have kind of completely changed the ecosystem of the lakes. And it was it took 18 months to grow a decent crop of these little pests on my Henry Moore sculpture. And then he was kind of dried out and displayed in the galleries, which in the power plant in Toronto, which overlooks the lake from where it was dragged. Moore was, he's a much celebrated figure in Toronto. They even built a museum dedicated to him, or a wing of a museum dedicated to him. And he donated many works to the city, and this was the first work that was bought by a North American museum of his in the 1950s. And it was introduced to the museum by Anthony Blunt, the famous art historian and spy, who was an advisor to the AGO in the 1950s. And it was a rather controversial work. It was considered to be sort of brutish and uncharacteristic of Moore's output. But when I was doing that project in Toronto, I came across the story of another Moore sculpture, which in a way sort of developed a strange double identity as a sculpture. It was a work which has two names. In Chicago, at Chicago University, it's known as nuclear energy. And in its other manifestation as Atom Piece, which was actually the original name that Moore gave to it. But Chicago University commissioned it as a monument to mark the first sustained nuclear reaction that was orchestrated by Enrico Fermi in the run-up to the beginnings of the atom bomb project. And this work, this story sort of re-emerged when I was invited to go and make an exhibition in Hiroshima at the Museum of Modern Art, the City Museum of Modern Art in Hiroshima. And I discovered that they had a version of the same sculpture in their collection, known as Atom Piece there. And there had been this big controversy there in the museum because a member of public, discovered that this sculpture had a link to this monument, this sort of celebratory monument to the beginning of the atom bomb project. And it was actually taken out of the permanent display of the museum and now has a very strange kind of presence in the museum. So I was kind of interested in how this object could have acquired sort of these two lives in a way. And the sculpture kind of derives from some earlier masks and heads that Moore made over the years, particularly these kind of post-war helmet heads. But it also very clearly relates to a poster that was made designed in the same year as the making of the original maquette for the sculpture, 1963, by Henrion, the graphic designer, and it's a poster for CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which is a very iconic piece of design now with this skull and this mushroom cloud superimposed. But in fact, Moore sort of later sort of distanced these sort of political readings in a way of the work by introducing a kind of a decoy into the situation. He was, after 1963, he'd been given an elephant skull by some friends. And he later, 6 years after making the original maquette, he took the maquette back into the studio and pretended to be making it again for these photographs, which sort of created this very, sort of, in a way, naturalized somehow the form of the sculpture and distanced it from these sort of, these political associations. This is the making of the working model for the large. This is more sort of sizing up the sculpture in Berlin where it was cast before it went to Chicago. This is at the Neue National Gallery. He just brought it along and stuck it there to see how it felt, I think, in public space. And this is the Atom Piece work as it exists in Hiroshima. So what I did was I started to work on a sort of proposition for a piece of theatre in a way, which brought the story of the evolution of this sculpture, this kind of double identity of the sculpture, into relation to another story of double identity, which is a Japanese no play about a young noble boy who tries to escape from his past by disguising himself with the help of a hat maker, and it's a kind of ancient Japanese fable. And no theatre is a kind of it's a very, very entrenched, very traditional form of theatre, which involves kind of a lot of identity changing. Sort of there are no female actors in no theatre, so men have to become women by assuming masks. Old people become young, and ghosts become human, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of kind of shape-shifting going on in no theatre. And it seemed to have a sort of resonance in relation to this story of this kind of skull, whether it's an elephant skull or a human skull, of Henry Moore's sculpture. It was also a little bit, there was a precedent for this kind of engagement with no theatre. There's a W.B. Yeats in 1916 wrote a no-inspired play, which is actually an Irish kind of folk tale transcribed into the form of a piece of no theatre, which was performed in London in 1916. This is one of the few photographs that exist of the cast of the play. It was called At the Hawk's Well. Not a great play, I don't think, but interesting moment. So I hooked up with a no mask maker, a guy called Yasuo Michi, who lives in Osaka in a tiny little apartment and works there too. And he makes these utterly magical masks, often kind of copies of historical masks. And he amazingly agreed to take part in the project and to collaborate with me on the project, which involved producing a series of designs for 9 different masks that would be made, characters that would be sort of Cold War characters that would sort of occupy the narrative of this no play. So it's a kind of collage of two cultures in a way. So I started to make some drawings, which I gave to Yasuo, and this is James Bond, of course, who from the film Goldfinger, who plays a gold merchant in the play, and Colonel Sander from Kentucky Fried Chicken, who plays an innkeeper. Colonel Sander's a big kind of important kind of character in Japan in a way. Post-war, and Joseph Hirshhorn, the art collector and uranium sort of mogul who made money at the beginning of the Cold War from this kind of mining operation in Canada, who was also a huge collector of Henry Moore's work. He plays Kumusaka in the play, the bad guy. And then Henry Moore, who plays the hat maker, who makes the disguise for the young noble boy. So this kind of process began, and Yasuo worked for about 9 months on these 9 masks, and I went and filmed him working on various stages of the mask making process, and that became the kind of backdrop, the visual backdrop for the telling of these stories in a film. This is the Moore mask ready for painting with gesso. They make these kind of dedications under the gesso. They put 9 layers of gesso on top of the wood, but they bury these messages in a way underneath. And Yasuo, unbeknownst to me, wrote "Ban the bomb" on Henry Moore's forehead in Japanese, and then a dedication to his assistant as well, and to Siemi, the founder of No Theatre. This is the James Bond mask. So in a way, this tiny workshop, mask maker's workshop in Osaka, becomes a kind of portal to a very complex web of connections and historical material, which is sort of played out in the narrative of the film. This is the mask for Ushiwaka, the young noble boy, which of course is the sculpture, Atom Peace, or Nuclear Energy. And this is the mask of Colonel Sander. And Anthony Blunt also features, again, he plays the hat maker's wife, who has a kind of secret past in the play. Henry Moore's hair. And that's the Kumusaka mask. And the back side of the Kumusaka mask. And the work as it was shown in Hiroshima and other places, is a kind of a film and then a series of masks. The masks are arranged out in front of a mirror, which kind of refers to the mirror room of no theatre, where you fit your mask and are kind of almost sort of I don't know, like occupied by the spirit of the historical character that you're about to perform, possessed, I suppose you'd say. And then on the other side of that screen, where the mirror is hanging, is the projection of the film itself. And I think I have time just to play a little moment of that to give you a sense of how that kind of all functions. If I can find it now. Hang on a second. Here. Oh, here we go again. Sorry about this. Doesn't like my films today, it seems. Damn it. How tiresome. I'm sorry. Somehow it
Project for a Masquerade, Hiroshima.
dear me.
The mirror room, the stage,
Okay. Doesn't seem to want to do this.
a 16th century Japanese tale of personal reinvention, double identities and disguise, restaged as a Cold War drama. With James Bond, Joseph Hirshhorn, Enrico Fermi, Anthony Blunt, Colonel Sanders, and with the multifaceted atom piece as Ushiwaka, the exiled son of the defeated Lord Yoshitomo, fleeing from incarceration in the temple of Mount Kurama, with the help of Henry Moore as the hat maker who fashions his disguise. The positions of the 12-strong unmasked no chorus will be filled by a Polish-American street gang, Chicago's The Back of the Yards Boys. The first characters to cross the bridge that links the no dressing room, the so-called mirror room, to the stage are the gold merchant, Kichiji, and his brother, Kichiroku. In the highly ritualized atmosphere of the mirror room, the principal actors fit their masks and are physically possessed by the characters they will portray on stage. It is a space in which identities are traded. Ghosts assume human form, men are transformed into women, the young become old, and the old young. Once on stage, Kichiji and Kichiroku are soon joined by the young noble boy, Ushiwaka. Our two gold merchants have amassed a great store of treasure and are taking it east to sell. When Ushiwaka asks to join them on their journey, they are initially skeptical of his motives, but eventually agree that he might join their party. A decision that will finally save their lives and their fortune, as later in the play, Ushiwaka single-handedly fights off the notoriously opportunistic bandit Kumasaka and his band of brigands. In this Cold War restaging of the Japanese classic, the role of Kichiji will be played by James Bond, as portrayed by Sean Connery in the 1964 film adaptation of Ian Fleming's 1959 novel Goldfinger. The novel's eponymous villain, Auric Goldfinger, threatens global economic stability by accumulating huge quantities of gold and smuggling them to the Russians disguised as car body panels for his Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. In the film version of the novel's 27-page-long game of cat and mouse on the golf course, Bond, posing as an illicit gold merchant, drops a bar of Nazi gold on the green just as Goldfinger is about to putt, and this hook and the promise of more such bars gives the undercover agent a momentary foothold in Goldfinger's smuggling operation, which finally allows him to foil plans to irradiate the entire US gold reserve with a Russian-built nuclear device, preventing a dramatic shift in global economic power.
That's, yeah, just a little taster. You'll be able to see the whole film in, at the IMA shortly. Yeah, I'm a little bit conscious about time. Do I have time to talk about one last thing, or I don't know? Yeah? Is it okay? I'll make it brief. I just wanted to talk, a little bit about the other kind of longer film work in the exhibition, which is something made last year to, as was said earlier, to mark the Transit of Venus, the 2012 Transit of Venus, which happened in June last year, and it was a commission by Oxford University and the Modern Art Oxford, the gallery in Oxford, to think about a work to sort of, I don't know, to mark that very significant historical event. It's not something that's so significant to science anymore, but as a piece of as a sort of moment in scientific history, very, very important. And it was an event that was used in the past to try and establish the size of the solar system, a very fundamental kind of, they sort of, for many years, they knew the shape of it, the solar system, but not how big it was. And the Transit of Venus was used as an attempt to measure make an accurate measurement of the astronomical unit by sort of triangulating measurements made in different locations on the face of the Earth. And if you knew the distance between those different places you were observing the event, then you could triangulate a measurement for the astronomical unit. This is the Radcliffe Observatory where the film was eventually displayed, and was also built at the moment of the Transit of Venus in the 18th century. This is an image from 1874 from the transit observations made by the British in Honolulu, and this is an image from my film of the transit in 2012, made from the top of a 4,000 meter high volcano in Hawaii, where we were kind of almost guaranteed good weather for observing the event. It's amazing that scientists traveled halfway around the world, taking months to get there in the past, and then they had a cloudy day and didn't see anything. So we were very lucky. The actual event takes about 6 hours for the small black dot of Venus to pass across the face of the sun. One of the most extraordinary things about the event is this sort of sense of the timing. They hundreds of years ago, they determined when, almost to the second, the transit would begin. And sure enough, you look at your watch and it turns up bang on time 300 years later. It's kind of mesmerizing in a way. This is an etching from the collection at the Museum of Science in Oxford, which charts the course of the transits over a sort of several thousand years. This is Jeremiah Horrocks, who was a young, enthusiastic scientist who was the first astronomer to really make sort of rigorous observations of a transit of Venus. This is the famous Captain Cook and William Green drawings that were made of what's called the black drop effect, which became the title of my film. And it's a kind of moment when the black disk of Venus crosses the edge of the sun, and it appears to form a kind of tail, or it deforms. And it meant that the timings of these crucial timings of the transit were very, very difficult, because you didn't know really when to start the clock on the timing, especially when you were looking through a telescope. The two, Green and Cook, who were both observing the event through similar telescopes, kind of recorded very, very different times for the beginning of the transit, which made their calculations very spurious, of course. And in the 19th century, when photography came into play in science, this man with the beard in the middle, Jules Janssen, he thought that if you could photograph the event with sort of timed exposures, that you could then sort of, after the event, make a more sort of accurate determination of the beginning and the end of the transit. And so he developed a chronophotographic device in 1874, and there were 6 or 7 of these devices that were sent around the world with different observation teams. He went to Japan, and you can just see the device on the kind of little wooden stool at the back there, on the left-hand side. And it was a forerunner of Etienne Jules Maret's photographic revolver, and also the cinematograph, of course, the Lumiere brothers. Actually, Jules Janssen actually features in one of the first films. In the 1890s, he was filmed arriving in Lyon for the Society of French Photographers meeting. This is his drawing of the black drop effect from one of his sketchbooks. And this is the device. The drawing was made actually after the event, it seems. And this is the French team in Japan observing the transit. His device never really worked so well, and actually there are very few plates existing, and the ones that do exist are actually test plates that were made prior with a kind of transit model prior to the actual event. So it was this kind of, a failed piece of science, but a very important piece of the history of cinema in a way. This is the staircase leading up to the observatory in Oxford, a very beautiful staircase, where the film was eventually shown. And again, it's a film that thinks about the relationship between moving image and still images, and it's a film that kind of interrogates the making of a film. It's sort of staged in a editing suite in Berlin, and everything is sort of it's a sort of attempt by somebody to try and give shape to a complex narrative, a complex kind of web of connections through time and space on this old 35mm Steenbeck editing table. And it's sort of constantly pulling and pushing in and out of different kinds of spaces, the space of the editing table and the space of the screen where the images are being projected, and then the space of the outside world, of Hawaii and Tahiti where the film was made. This is the observatories at the top of the Mauna Kea, the volcano where we filmed the Transit of Venus, 4,000 meters. And this is the lighthouse at Point Venus in Tahiti, where Cook and Green observed the event. And unfortunately, we don't have time to see any of the film, but again, it'll be shown at the IMA when the exhibition opens there. It's in a way, the kind of crucial thing was this idea that my filming of the event on celluloid would perhaps be the last time that could possibly happen. That somehow the 1874 transit marks the beginning of sort of cinema in some sense, and then the transit in 2012 is perhaps the kind of the notional end of that kind of technology. I think in the next transit is not till 2117, and it's very unlikely that anybody will be using celluloid in 2117, I imagine. So yeah, thank you for coming, and if there's one or two questions, then I'll be happy to answer them.
Hopefully short questions.
Yeah, sorry I went on too long. It's fine if there aren't. All right. Good. Yeah, go. Yeah.
Well, look, it falls to me to offer a vote of very generous thanks to Simon for that fantastic lecture. Thinking as we arrived at the Transit of Venus work at the end of the talk, I think it takes about 248 years or something like that for the Transit of Venus to occur. I don't think I'm exactly right there, but there is, of course, a very precise time, as Simon has elaborated. But thinking about that, it seems that almost everything that Simon touched upon today was time-based, or was about process through the course and passage of time. And I haven't seen the work in the Devine Gallery in the Tate, but I've read a little bit about it, and it's interesting that many of you will have gone to that gallery many times, and like me, when you go back to such a distinctive architectural space, you often carry with you a very strong memory of work that you've seen previously there. I know I certainly do, and the work that I think that Simon's created there sort of almost reveals spaces like museum spaces like that Devine Gallery as palimpsests that carry with them the kind of succession of memories of works that have preceded. And that was very much the idea, I think, that also operated around the work that he made in Berlin. So much of his work is about change and process, and processing things from one state through into another, and then often, as he's indicated on several occasions, returning back to their original state, at least in some form, albeit with the kind of markings and scars of the passage of life that they've just undergone. It's really great to hear a talk about the ideas that lie behind an artist like Simon's work. Too often, with conceptually based practice, there's a lot that you're left to imagine and reimagine for yourself. So it's a great privilege for us to have an opportunity to hear from someone like Simon, whose work has always been driven by the notion of idea. And it was really interesting to me to see the number of times that coincidence and chance and serendipity had played a role in nourishing the idea and looking at that shed and having a kind of 5-second revelation about the future of that shed and then back again. So it's been great. You've been tremendously generous, Simon, with your time. I think you did master the technology. It eventually all worked. But it's been great to get some sense of the film work and some sense of the works that have preceded the projects that's coming to us in the IMA in October. And I know that all of us can't wait for that project to open so that we can see it for ourselves. But would you join me again in very warmly thanking Simon for his talk?